While thousands of fans roared under the blinding stadium lights, Stevie Ray Vaughan was backstage, sick and exhausted after years of pushing his body far beyond its limits. To keep a multi-million-dollar tour moving, the music industry pushed Double Trouble into a brutal cycle of exploitation, forcing them to survive a grueling schedule while falling deeper into cocaine and alcohol abuse that had become common on the touring circuit. The most sinister twist of this tragedy is that these three brothers actually fought their way back from the brink of death and got completely clean. Yet, the moment they reclaimed their souls, that same relentless touring schedule led to a late-night helicopter flight meant to avoid traffic after the show. That fatal crash into a fog-shrouded mountain didn't just end a blues legend's life, it permanently shattered the brotherhood left on the ground, exposing the brutal cost of life on the road. Yet the true heartbreak lies in the pure brotherhood this machine tore apart. Long before the blood and the crash, they stepped into a completely barren musical landscape. In the early 1980s, the blues was widely considered a dying art form, a relic relegated to smoky back alley clubs and fading memories, while the mainstream charts were utterly dominated by polished pop and artificial sounds. The industry was obsessed with the synthetic. Then came three men from Austin, Texas, who played with such terrifying, visceral ferocity that they forced the world to look backwards and remember what real sweat and wood sounded like. Stevie Ray Vaughan was the focal point, a man who channeled the spirits of Jimi Hendrix and Albert King through his fingers. But Stevie was not a solo act, no matter how hard the record labels tried to market him as one. He was tethered to the earth by Double Trouble. Tommy Shannon was the older, road-hardened veteran who had played bass with Johnny Winter at Woodstock. He had seen the heights of the 1960s rock revolution and the dark depths of its aftermath. He and Stevie shared a profound, almost telepathic musical and emotional connection. When Tommy played, he didn't just follow Stevie's frantic lead, he anticipated it, grounding the guitarist's wild cosmic solos with heavy swinging bass lines that hit like a physical weight. Chris Layton was the rhythmic engine, driving the band forward with a relentless, shuffling Texas groove. He was the anchor, the most level-headed of the trio, the man who kept the tempo when everything else threatened to spiral out of control. Together, they were a single, breathing organism. They weren't just hired hands or backing musicians. They were a deeply bonded brotherhood of misfits who lived entirely for the music they made together. For years, they played the gritty, unforgiving club circuit of Texas, sleeping in vans, eating cheap food, and playing for hours on end just to earn enough to get to the next town. It was a hard life, but it was theirs. They belonged to the music, not to a corporation. The turning point arrived in 1982 at the Montreux Jazz Festival in Switzerland. Their raw, aggressive performance shocked the European crowd, drawing both boos from purists and the rapt attention of musical giants like David Jackson and David Bowie. Bowie immediately recruited Stevie to play on his upcoming album, Let's Dance, a move that thrust the Texas guitarist into the global spotlight. Shortly after, the legendary talent scout John Hammond signed Stevie Ray Vaughan and Double Trouble to Epic Records. It felt like the ultimate triumph for the underdogs. They had dragged the blues back from the grave and onto the main stage, but signing that major label contract was the moment they stepped off the dusty roads of Texas and onto a high-speed conveyor belt that would slowly, methodically drain their lifeblood. The moment the executives realized that Double Trouble was a gold mine, the exploitation began in earnest. The band had inadvertently resurrected an entire genre, and the commercial demand from the public was staggering. To capitalize on this sudden, massive wave of popularity, management locked the trio into an inhumane punishing schedule. They were booked for hundreds of shows a year, crisscrossing the globe from North America to Europe to Japan. They were expected to record new albums in the fleeting, exhausted gaps between legs of the tour and immediately pack their bags to hit the road again to promote them. There were no holidays. There were no designated periods for physical or mental recovery. The stage is often romanticized by audiences as a place of magic and artistic freedom. But for Double Trouble, it rapidly became a site of brutal physical degradation. Stevie played his Stratocaster with unusually heavy-gauge strings, resembling thick wire more than standard guitar strings. This gave him his signature colossal tone, but it required immense punishing finger strength to bend the notes. Night after night, performing 2-hour sets of high-intensity, physically demanding blues rock, the friction would literally rip the calluses from his fingers, leaving raw, bleeding flesh exposed to the steel. The pain was excruciating. To cope, Stevie famously resorted to using medical superglue to attach pieces of his own torn skin back onto his fingertips, just so he could physically make it through the next set. Tommy and Chris were enduring their own forms of physical torture. Playing a swinging, driving Texas blues rhythm section requires intense physical stamina. The repetitive strain, the heavy lifting of gear, the endless hours trapped in cramped buses and aeroplanes began to rot their bodies from the inside out. They were aching from the relentless travel, the chronic lack of sleep, and the terrible diets that consisted mostly of whatever could be found at a petrol station at 3 a.m. But the touring schedule did not care about torn skin or aching joints. Every night the lights went down, the amps came on, and the band had to perform no matter what condition they were in. To survive this grueling physical and mental marathon, the band turned to the only coping mechanism readily available, pushed upon them, and normalized within the 1980s music scene: hard drugs and alcohol. What began in their early club days as a way to blow off steam or celebrate a good gig quickly morphed into a grim, vital survival tool. Cocaine gave them the artificial chemical energy needed to stand up, strap on their instruments, and perform when their bodies were screaming for sleep. Whiskey numbed the sharp pain of ripped fingers, the dull ache of travel-worn bones, and the creeping psychological isolation of being surrounded by thousands of people, yet feeling completely alone. They weren't partying to celebrate their success. They were self-medicating simply to survive the schedule that their management had imposed upon them. As the tours dragged on into 1984 and 1985, the descent into addiction became steep and terrifying. The brotherhood began to fracture under the immense chemical weight. Tommy Shannon spiraled deeply into substance abuse, often finding himself locked in a dark, unfamiliar hotel room with Stevie, the two of them consuming horrific amounts of cocaine and alcohol just to feel a baseline of normality. They became isolated, paranoid, and physically sick. Chris Layton, who managed to avoid the worst of the hard drug addiction, was trapped in the agonizing, helpless position of the sober witness. He watched from the drum riser as his two closest friends, the men he loved like brothers, wasted away. He saw the missed cues, the erratic behavior, the glazed eyes. He was helpless to stop the cycle that kept pushing them forward no matter the cost, because the machine was signing the checks and booking the flights. The handlers saw the deterioration, but they chose management over intervention. A canceled tour meant lost revenue, breached contracts, and furious promoters. It was far cheaper and easier to hire people to ensure the band had a steady supply of whatever chemicals they needed to keep moving. The environment around touring made addiction easy and recovery difficult. They demanded an impossible physical output, provided the drugs necessary to achieve that output, and then looked the other way when the side effects began to manifest. By the time the band was touring to support their album Soul to Soul, the situation had devolved from a dangerous habit into a daily brush with death. Stevie's addiction had become so severe, so deeply ingrained in his daily routine, that his body began to literally break down. Years of snorting industrial quantities of cocaine had severely damaged the fragile cartilage in his nose. It began to collapse, making it agonizingly painful to breathe, let alone snort anything further. But the addiction, combined with the crushing pressure to keep performing, demanded feeding. In desperation, he reportedly resorted to extremely dangerous ways of consuming cocaine when his body could no longer tolerate it. First thing in the morning to get out of bed, this highly corrosive, toxic mixture would hit his empty stomach. The biological result was catastrophic. Years of substance abuse caused severe stomach damage and painful ulcers. He would wake up in pain and sickness, his body clearly breaking down from years of abuse. He was losing weight rapidly, his skin taking on a gray, deathly pallor. Yet the tour managers and the label executives stood by. The logic of the industry was simple and harsh. As long as he could stand upright and hold a guitar, the show must go on. They would wipe the blood from his chin, ply him with whatever was necessary to get his heart rate up, and shove the trio onto the stage. It is a chilling, damning indictment of the music business that thousands of fans cheered rapturously for a man who was actively dying in front of them, entirely unaware that the brilliant, soaring guitar solos echoing through the arenas were being fueled by a body that was literally consuming itself from the inside out. The band was treated like a team of plow horses, whipped and spurred to keep pulling the heavy cart of the music industry until they dropped dead in the dirt. And they were getting dangerously close to the dirt. The tragedy of the mid-1980s for Double Trouble was the illusion of the dream. From the outside, looking at the magazine covers and the platinum records, they had achieved everything a musician could ever want. They had fame, wealth, and the adoration of millions. But from the inside of the tour bus, looking out at the endless blur of highway lines, the dream had become a mobile prison cell. The music, which had once been their salvation, their way of communicating with the world and with each other, had been weaponized against them. It was no longer an expression of the soul. It was a daily quota to be met. The industry had taken their pure, raw love for the blues and turned it into a blood-sucking machine, and the men caught in its gears were running out of blood to give. The brotherhood was fraying, the bodies were breaking, and the machine was only accelerating. The crash was coming, and when it hit, it would shatter everything they had built. The relentless grinding of the 1986 tour schedule did not merely push Stevie Ray Vaughan and Double Trouble to the edge of the abyss, it forced them to set up camp there. The industry had essentially placed a monumental wager on how long a human heart could continue to beat while being simultaneously poisoned and overworked. To fulfill their contractual obligations and satiate a market hungry for live albums, the label demanded the release of Live Alive, a compilation of performances recorded during this exact period of profound physical decay. Listening to it now is an exercise in auditory horror. You are not hearing the triumphant roar of a blues revival. You are hearing the frantic, desperate survival instincts of three men trying to play their way out of a burning building. The tempos are rushed, the energy is manic, and the playing, while still exhibiting flashes of undeniable genius, is frayed at the edges. It is the sound of a band running on the absolute last fumes of chemical adrenaline. By the time the European leg of the tour commenced in the autumn of 1986, the facade had entirely crumbled. Stevie's skin had taken on a translucent grayish-yellow hue. He was skeletal, his clothes hanging off his frame like rags on a scarecrow. Tommy Shannon was in a mirrored state of collapse, trapped in a paranoid, cocaine-induced psychosis, isolating himself in hotel rooms and avoiding mirrors because he could no longer recognize the hollowed-out face staring back at him. Chris Layton, the sober sentinel, was left to manage the logistics of the band, was barely holding together physically and emotionally. The handlers, the tour managers, and the venue promoters were no longer managing musicians. They were managing a crisis, calculating the exact dosage of narcotics required to prop the men up for 90 minutes under the stage lights before packing them back into their coffins on wheels. The physical breaking point arrived with terrifying finality in Ludwigshafen, Germany. The venue was packed, the crowd roaring for the guitar god they had read about in the music press. But the man who shuffled onto the stage was a ghost. Stevie was sweating profusely, his hands trembling so violently he could barely grip the neck of his Fender Stratocaster. Halfway through the set, his body simply shut down. The complex, highly demanding motor skills required to play his brand of ferocious Texas blues evaporated. He stumbled, pale and disorientated, eventually collapsing from sheer physical exhaustion, severe dehydration, and internal bleeding. The cocaine and whiskey cocktail had finally eaten its way through his defenses. He was rushed to medical care, a chaotic scene of panic that had nothing to do with compassion and everything to do with liability and lost revenue. When the doctors examined him, they were appalled. His liver was failing, his stomach lining was severely ulcerated, and his heart was struggling to maintain a rhythm under the massive chemical strain. The medical ultimatum delivered to Stevie was blunt, terrifying, and completely devoid of industry spin. If he took another drink or snorted another line, he would be dead within a month. His body was entirely bankrupt. It was only at this exact moment, when the primary asset was physically incapable of standing upright, when the tool was broken beyond immediate repair, that the massive grinding gears of the tour machine finally screeched to a halt. The remaining European dates were canceled. The promoters raged. The label executives calculated the financial losses, and the industry lawyers scrambled. But for Stevie Ray Vaughan, Tommy Shannon, and Chris Layton, This cancellation was not a breach of contract. It was a miraculous, desperate reprieve. The schedule finally stopped long enough for them to step away and try to save themselves. The decision to seek treatment was not made in a corporate boardroom. It was made in the quiet, desperate spaces between three brothers who realized they were about to lose everything, including their lives. Stevie was admitted to a rehabilitation facility in Atlanta, Georgia. Tommy Shannon, looking at his own trembling hands and recognizing the exact same death sentence, checked himself into a facility in Austin, Texas. Chris Layton returned home, carrying the heavy, silent burden of the survivor, waiting to see if the two men he loved more than anything else in the world would ever walk out of those hospitals alive. Rehabilitation in the 1980s was a brutal, unforgiving process. For Stevie and Tommy, it meant stripping away the protective armor of the rock star myth. They had to face the blinding, sober reality of the physical damage they had inflicted upon themselves, and more terrifyingly, they had to face the underlying anxieties, insecurities, and pressures that had driven them to self-medicate in the first place. The withdrawal was agonizing. They suffered through the sweats, the tremors, and the profound crushing depression that follows years of dopamine depletion. The music industry did not send flowers or offer emotional support. The industry simply tapped its collective watch, waiting to see if the investment could be salvaged. But within the sterile walls of the clinics, something profound began to happen. Without the deafening noise of the tour schedule, without the relentless pressure to perform, the foundational love for the music, the very thing the industry had exploited, began to return. Stevie and Tommy began to communicate again, not through the haze of cocaine paranoia, but with genuine, terrifying vulnerability. They committed themselves entirely to the 12-step program, applying the same obsessive, relentless dedication to their sobriety that they had previously applied to their instruments. They were fighting a war for their souls, and for the first time in years, they were winning. When Stevie and Tommy finally emerged from treatment, they were entirely unrecognizable from the skeletal ghosts who had collapsed in Germany. They had gained weight, their eyes were clear, and the color had returned to their skin. But the most terrifying obstacle still lay ahead. They had to pick up their instruments. For years, they had convinced themselves that the drugs and the alcohol were the source of their stamina, the fuel for their creativity, the magic dust that allowed them to channel the blues. Playing sober was a terrifying prospect. Would the fire still be there? Would the groove still swing? Or had they left their talent at the bottom of a whiskey bottle? The answer came when the trio finally reunited in a rehearsal space. Chris Layton counted off the tempo, Tommy Shannon locked into the bass line, and Stevie Ray Vaughan struck the first chord. The sound that erupted from the amplifiers was not just intact, it was magnificent. Stripped of the frantic chemical edge, their playing possessed a new depth, a profound clarity, and a joyous, unburdened power. They realized with overwhelming relief that the drugs had never been the source of their talent. The drugs had been the cage holding their talent hostage. They were free. This triumphant resurrection was immortalized in their 1989 studio album, In Step. The title itself was a nod to their newfound sobriety and their synchronized, unified brotherhood. The album is a masterpiece of modern blues, featuring tracks like Crossfire, Tightrope, and Wall of Denial, songs with lyrics that explicitly detailed their battle with addiction, the suffocating pressure of the industry, and the hard-won clarity of survival. Stevie's guitar tone was sharper, more expressive, and more emotionally resonant than ever before. Tommy and Chris provided a rhythmic foundation that was virtually unshakable. They had gone to the absolute edge of human endurance, stared into the abyss, and walked back with the best music of their careers. In Step was a massive commercial and critical success. It won a Grammy Award and introduced Double Trouble to an even wider mainstream audience. They had achieved the impossible. They had beaten the statistics, conquered their demons, and returned to the top of the music world on their own terms, clean, sober, and united. They had reclaimed their humanity from a system designed to strip it away. But the music industry is an entity devoid of memory and incapable of sentimentality. The executives did not look at the success of In Step and see a beautiful story of human redemption. They looked at the soaring record sales, the Grammy Awards, and the massive public goodwill, and they saw a newly refurbished, highly profitable product ready to be put back on the market. After 1986, the touring machine started moving again. The tour promoters drafted new contracts, the booking agents filled the calendars, and the logistics teams began charting the flights and the bus routes. Stevie, Tommy, and Chris had fought a grueling war to get clean, believing the drugs and alcohol were their greatest enemies. They walked out of rehab and recorded In Step with the clarity of sobriety and a brotherhood forged in fire, but they had misidentified the true monster. The monster wasn't in the bottle, it was the itinerary. The industry was thrilled to have its most lucrative assets sober and functional again, only to immediately thrust them back into the exact same brutal, logistical meat grinder that had nearly killed them the first time. The touring schedule didn't care about their redemption. It only demanded they hit the next city, setting the stage for a logistical calculation that would ultimately shatter them against the side of a mountain. The return of Stevie Ray Vaughan and Double Trouble to the global stage in 1989 was heralded by the music press as the ultimate rock and roll redemption story. The narrative was perfectly packaged for public consumption. The tortured bluesman who walked through the fire, slayed his demons, and emerged with a Grammy-winning masterpiece. Record executives at Epic were thrilled. In Step was flying off the shelves, and the band's newfound sobriety meant they were no longer a financial liability. They were punctual, they were coherent in interviews, and their live performances were sharper and more explosive than ever. To the industry accountants, a sober Double Trouble was the most lucrative version of Double Trouble. But what the glossy magazine spreads and the congratulatory boardroom handshakes failed to acknowledge was the terrifying reality of what awaited the band when the studio doors closed. They had cured their chemical dependencies, but they were immediately thrust back into the exact same brutal, relentless environment that had bred those dependencies in the first place. Stepping onto the tour bus in the summer of 1989 was a profound psychological shock for Stevie, Tommy, and Chris. For years, the road had been a blur of cocaine psychosis and whiskey-soaked blackouts. The drugs had acted as a thick chemical shock absorber against the crushing monotony of highway travel, the deafening volume of the arenas, and the bone-deep exhaustion of playing a 2-hour set of aggressive Texas blues every single night. Now that shock absorber was completely gone. They were facing the tour with absolute unvarnished clarity. Every jolt of the bus tires on the asphalt, every blinding flash of the stage lights, and every aching muscle was felt with hypersensitive intensity. The sheer logistical violence of a world tour, the early morning lobby calls, the endless hours trapped in transit, the terrible food, and the isolation of unfamiliar hotel rooms was suddenly unavoidable. The industry, eager to recoup the time and momentum lost during the band's rehabilitation, booked a schedule that was nothing short of punitive. Promoters and booking agents looked at a map of North America and Europe and drew lines connecting cities with absolute disregard for human geography or physical stamina. A gig in Chicago on a Tuesday would be followed by a gig in Detroit on a Wednesday, Toronto on a Thursday, and Montreal on a Friday. The routing was designed to maximize profit margins, keeping the trucks moving and the venues packed. To the people sitting in air-conditioned offices in Los Angeles and New York, the band members were simply data points on a spreadsheet. There was no consideration given to the fact that Stevie's fingers were still bleeding onto his fretboard, or that Tommy Shannon's back was locking up from the sheer physical weight of holding a bass guitar for hours on end, or that Chris Layton was burning thousands of calories a night driving the rhythm section. Yet despite the crushing physical toll, the brotherhood between the three men reached a level of profound, almost sacred depth during this period. Without the paranoid isolation of addiction, they genuinely reconnected. They became deeply protective of one another. The road is a notoriously hostile environment for anyone in recovery. The backstage areas of late 1980s rock concerts were still overflowing with free alcohol and hangers-on eager to offer drugs to the headliners. To combat this, Double Trouble transformed their backstage area into a fortress of sobriety. They demanded that all alcohol be removed from their dressing rooms. Instead of attending wild after-parties, Stevie and Tommy would frequently seek out local Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in whatever city they happened to be playing in, sitting in folding chairs in church basements, anonymous amongst strangers, fighting a daily battle to maintain their grip on reality. Chris Layton, the ever-watchful sentinel, stood guard over their fragile peace, ensuring the logistical machine did not grind them down emotionally, even as it ground them down physically. The performances during the In-Step tour were nothing short of miraculous. Stripped of the frantic, rushing tempo of their cocaine years, their music found a deep, terrifyingly powerful groove. Stevie's guitar playing was no longer a desperate plea for survival. It was a joyous, authoritative declaration of life. When he played the opening notes of Texas Flood or Crossfire, he was playing with a level of dynamic control and emotional resonance that left audiences weeping. Tommy and Chris laid down a rhythm section so thick and intuitive it felt like a force of nature. But this musical transcendence required an immense output of energy. They were giving the audience every single drop of blood, sweat, and soul they had. And when the final chord rang out and the house lights came up, the adrenaline crash was devastating. In the past, they would have softened that crash with a bottle of Crown Royal. Now, they had to sit in the dressing room, exhausted, their ears ringing, drinking lukewarm water, and facing the stark reality of the schedule. The tour manager would knock on the door, clipboard in hand, announcing that the bus was leaving in 20 minutes for a 500-mile overnight drive to the next venue. The cycle was inescapable. The industry praised their recovery, marketed their sobriety, and then systematically subjected them to a routine that would break the strongest of men. They were commodifying the band's redemption, wringing every last cent out of the narrative, while willfully ignoring the human beings inside the machine. By the spring of 1990, Double Trouble was operating at the absolute zenith of their commercial power. They were no longer just a successful blues band. They were global stadium acts. It was at this juncture that their management secured them a spot on a mammoth, co-headlining summer tour with Eric Clapton. This was not a club tour. These were massive outdoor amphitheaters and sprawling arenas. The scale of the production was staggering, involving fleets of articulated lorries, massive lighting rigs, and a traveling crew of hundreds. For Stevie, Tommy, and Chris, sharing a stage with Eric Clapton, a man who had survived his own well-documented battles with addiction, felt like the ultimate validation. It was a summit of guitar gods. However, the sheer size of the tour meant that the logistical demands were exponentially higher. The routing was brutal. The summer heat was oppressive. The band found themselves trapped in a relentless cycle of sound checks, press interviews, meet and greets, and monumental evening performances. The corporate sponsors demanded their pound of flesh, insisting on appearances and photo opportunities. The record label, hungry for a follow-up to In Step, was already pressing the band to write and record new material while on the road. The pressure was suffocating. Stevie, in particular, was carrying the weight of the world. He had become an icon of recovery, a beacon of hope for addicts everywhere, and the responsibility of maintaining that public image while privately enduring the physical exhaustion of the tour was an immense burden. Friends and crew members later recalled a distinct change in Stevie during those final summer months of 1990. He was playing with a fiery, almost desperate urgency, as if he knew his time was limited. He spent his quiet moments reading spiritual literature, constantly seeking a deeper understanding of his own existence. He was incredibly kind, taking the time to speak with fans and crew, radiating a profound, hard-won humility. But physically, the strain was visible. The dark circles had returned under his eyes. He was plagued by terrible nightmares and a creeping, unshakable sense of anxiety. The machine was pushing him to the absolute limit. He was sober, he was healthy, but he was profoundly, dangerously tired. As August drew to a close, the tour rolled into East Troy, Wisconsin, for a two-night stand at the Alpine Valley Music Theater. It was a massive, sprawling outdoor venue nestled in the hills, capable of holding tens of thousands of people. The dates were scheduled for the 25th and 26th of August. It was the climax of the summer leg, a monumental gathering of blues royalty. Alongside Eric Clapton and Double Trouble, the bill featured Robert Cray, Buddy Guy, and Stevie's older brother Jimmy Vaughan. For the Vaughan brothers, who had just finished recording a collaborative album titled Family Style, it was a deeply emotional reunion. The stage was set for a historic weekend of music, but behind the scenes, the logistical nightmare was reaching its peak. Alpine Valley is located in a relatively remote area, notoriously difficult to access and exit, especially with a crowd of nearly 40,000 people. The management, desperate to keep their star assets comfortable and more importantly, strictly on schedule for the next tour date in Chicago, had made a fateful decision. Instead of putting the headlining musicians on tour buses to fight through the hours of post-concert gridlock, they chartered a small fleet of Bell helicopters. The plan was simple: corporate efficiency, bypass the traffic, fly the artists over the hills, and drop them directly into the city so they could rest before the next corporate obligation. The musicians were not consulted on the safety of the airspace or the unpredictable microclimates of the Wisconsin hills. They were simply told where to be and when to board. The machine had made its calculation. Time was money, and the helicopters were the fastest way to keep the assembly line moving. As Stevie Ray Vaughan, Tommy Shannon, and Chris Layton prepared to take the stage on the night of August 26, 1990, they had no idea that the corporate obsession with the itinerary had just set a lethal trap. They were about to play the greatest, most triumphant show of their lives, completely unaware that the heavy, suffocating fog rolling over the hills outside the amphitheater was preparing to swallow them whole. The cruelest irony of the music industry's logistical machine is that it is entirely blind to the emotional and spiritual triumphs occurring on its stages. On the night of August 26th, Alpine Valley witnessed a blues communion. Stevie Ray Vaughan, standing shoulder to shoulder with his brother Jimmy, Eric Clapton, and Buddy Guy, played with a joyous, unchained ferocity that defied the exhaustion in his bones. He had survived the cocaine, he had survived the bleeding ulcers, and he had fought his way back to the top of the mountain alongside Tommy and Chris. The crowd roared, the final chords echoed into the night sky, and the Brotherhood stood victorious. But the moment the amplifiers were switched off, the spiritual victory was immediately superseded by the brutal, mechanical demands of the schedule. There was no time to celebrate. There was no time to breathe. The handlers were already pointing at their watches, ushering the exhausted musicians toward the waiting helicopters. The touring schedule had become so relentless that no one involved wanted to slow it down, and in the dark, fog-choked skies above Wisconsin, that belt was about to run out of track. The Alpine Valley Music Theater in East Troy, Wisconsin, is a sprawling wooden amphitheater carved into the side of a massive ski hill. On the night of August 26, 1990, it was the epicenter of the musical universe. The air was thick with the humidity of late summer, but on the stage the atmosphere was electric. This was the grand finale of a grueling weekend, the culmination of the co-headlining tour that had pushed Double Trouble and Eric Clapton across the vast expanse of North America. For Stevie Ray Vaughan, Tommy Shannon, and Chris Layton, this was not just another gig on a spreadsheet. It was a victory lap. They were playing with a profound, unburdened joy that only comes to men who have stared into their own graves and chosen to walk away. The climax of the evening was a jam session that has since been etched into the mythology of rock and roll. Eric Clapton invited Stevie, his older brother Jimmy Vaughan, blues legend Buddy Guy, and Robert Cray onto the stage for a monumental 20-minute rendition of Sweet Home Chicago. It was a breathtaking display of virtuosity and brotherhood. Behind the front line of guitarists, Chris Layton drove the rhythm with a relentless heavy shuffle, while Tommy Shannon anchored the chaotic brilliance with deep, swinging bass lines. They were a single, unstoppable force. Stevie, dressed in a black gaucho hat and a serape, played with his eyes closed, his face tilted toward the lighting rig. Those who were there noted that he wasn't just performing. He seemed to be in a state of spiritual transcendence, pouring every ounce of gratitude for his hard-won sobriety into the wood and wire of his Fender Stratocaster. When the final thunderous chord echoed out over the valley and the crowd of nearly 40,000 people erupted in a deafening roar, Stevie turned to Tommy and Chris. They shared a look of absolute exhausted triumph. They had survived the fire. They had won. But the music industry does not allow its workers to linger in the glow of spiritual victory. The moment the amplifiers were powered down, the brutal mechanical reality of the tour schedule reasserted itself. The backstage area immediately transformed from a sanctuary of artistic brotherhood into a frantic, highly stressed logistical hub. The venue was located miles away from major highways, and the sheer volume of vehicles attempting to leave the parking lots guaranteed hours of gridlock. For the tour managers and the promoters, this delay was entirely unacceptable. They had corporate obligations in Chicago the following day. To circumvent the traffic and keep the high-priced talent moving according to the itinerary, management had chartered a fleet of 4 Bell helicopters to ferry the artists and their core teams over the Wisconsin hills and directly into the city. As the adrenaline of the performance began to fade, the harsh realities of the physical environment set in. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and a dense pea soup fog was beginning to roll over the rolling terrain, swallowing the amphitheater and the surrounding ski slopes in a thick gray shroud. It was the kind of unpredictable, highly dangerous microclimate that plagues the region, turning clear night skies into opaque, disorientating walls of moisture. Stevie, Tommy, and Chris were exhausted. Their clothes were soaked in sweat, their muscles aching from the sheer physical output of the show. They were herded toward the makeshift landing pad, a grassy area near the venue where the helicopters were waiting, their rotors already spinning, cutting through the heavy mist with a deafening rhythmic thud. The urgency of the handlers was palpable. The schedule demanded compliance. In the chaotic, rushed scramble aboard the aircraft, the careful, protective unity of Double Trouble was fractured by logistical necessity. There was confusion over seating arrangements. Originally, the plan was for Stevie, Jimmy Vaughan, and Jimmy's wife Connie to fly back to Chicago together on the same helicopter. But as they approached the aircraft, they realized the seats were overbooked. The management of the tour had allocated spaces to Eric Clapton's core team, his American agent Bobby Brooks, his bodyguard Nigel Brown, and assistant tour manager Colin Smythe. Stevie, desperate to get back to the hotel and rest his battered body, learned there was exactly 1 seat left on the helicopter designated as Copters 3, a Bell 206B Jet Ranger piloted by a 41-year-old named Jeff Brown. Stevie turned to his brother and sister-in-law, asking if he could take the final seat. With the casual, mundane ease of a family that assumes there is always tomorrow, Jimmy and Connie agreed, opting to take a flight out the following morning. Stevie grabbed his bags. He turned back to the rest of the crew, to Tommy and Chris, who were sorting out their own transport logistics. There were no grand farewells, no premonitions of doom. It was simply the end of another long day at the office. Stevie flashed a tired, warm smile. "See you in Chicago," he said. He climbed into the back of the helicopter, pulling the door shut behind him. At 12:40 a.m. on the 27th of August, the Bell 206B lifted off the ground. The pilot, Jeff Brown, was experienced, but he was unfamiliar with the treacherous, undulating terrain of Alpine Valley, and he was flying under visual flight rules into a rapidly deteriorating weather system. The machine ascended into the pitch-black, suffocating fog. For those standing on the ground, the sound of the engine was quickly swallowed by the mist. What happened next took only a matter of seconds. The helicopter banked sharply to the left shortly after takeoff. Blinded by the fog and suffering from spatial disorientation, the pilot failed to realize he was not clearing the 1,000-foot ski hill immediately adjacent to the venue. Just over half a mile from the takeoff point, the aircraft slammed violently into the side of the mountain. There was no fiery explosion to alert the people below, no distress call over the radio. The sheer kinetic force of the impact pulverized the machine and everyone inside. Stevie Ray Vaughan, Bobby Brooks, Nigel Brown, Colin Smythe, and Jeff Brown were killed instantly. After years of relentless touring, a late-night helicopter flight ended in a tragic crash. The silence that followed was absolute. Because the crash site was obscured by the fog and the darkness, and because the helicopter had not exploded into flames, no one at the venue realized what had happened. The remaining helicopters took off. The buses rolled out, fighting the traffic. Tommy Shannon and Chris Layton made their way back to Chicago, exhausted but content, believing their brother was safely asleep in his own hotel room. The search for the missing aircraft would not begin for several hours, only after it was noticed that the helicopter had never arrived at its destination. The morning of August 27th broke with a heavy, sickening dread in downtown Chicago. Chris Layton was asleep in his hotel room when he was jolted awake by a frantic knocking at the door. He opened it to find their tour manager standing in the hallway, his face an ashen, tear-streaked mask of horror. The words that followed shattered Chris's reality into a million jagged pieces. Stevie was gone. The helicopter had been found shattered across the ski slope. There were no survivors. The immediate aftermath was a descent into an unimaginable psychological hell for Chris Layton and Tommy Shannon. Tommy, who had shared hotel rooms, deep depressions, and the miraculous climb back to sobriety with Stevie, collapsed completely. The grief was a physical, crushing weight. For years, the two men had been each other's life raft in the turbulent, toxic ocean of the music industry. They had fought a desperate, bloody war to save their frontman, to drag him away from the bleeding ulcers and the cocaine psychosis. They had succeeded against all odds. They had done the impossible. And now, this. It was a bitter, cruel irony that threatened to unhinge their minds. They had saved him from the drugs, only for him to be killed by the itinerary, the very machine that had driven them to self-destruction, the relentless demand to move faster, to play harder, to beat the traffic, to meet the corporate obligations, had finally claimed its ultimate prize. If the tour managers had simply allowed the band to wait out the fog, if they had put them on a bus instead of prioritizing speed over safety, Stevie would still be breathing. The system had treated a human life as a logistical hurdle, and the cost of that calculation was paid in blood on a Wisconsin hillside. The news of the crash sent shockwaves across the globe. The music press immediately went to work, canonizing Stevie Ray Vaughan as a tragic guitar deity, placing him in the same exalted, morbid pantheon as Jimi Hendrix and Duane Allman. The record labels prepared the tribute albums, the posthumous releases, and the box sets, turning the tragedy into a fresh, highly lucrative revenue stream. The gears of the industry did not stop turning. They simply shifted focus to monetize the mourning. But in the cold, devastating shadow of that global mourning, Tommy Shannon and Chris Layton were left utterly stranded. The industry mourned an asset. Tommy and Chris mourned a brother. They were double trouble, a rhythmic powerhouse that had just had its heart violently ripped out. They were stripped of their frontman, their closest friend, and their entire identity. For over a decade, their lives had been defined by the music they made with Stevie. Without him, the silence was deafening. They were survivors of a war, wandering through the debris, deeply traumatized and completely unmoored. The brotherhood that had defined them, that had saved them from the brink of the grave, had been violently dismantled by the sheer, unfeeling arrogance of the touring machine. As they packed their bags in that Chicago hotel room, preparing to fly back to Texas not to play a gig, but to bury their brother, the full devastating weight of their journey settled upon them. They had given the industry their youth, their health, and their sanity. They had bled onto the fretboards and vomited in the dressing rooms to keep the crowds cheering. They had finally taken their lives back, only to watch the industry's obsession with the schedule take it all away again in the blink of an eye. They were leaving the road, but the road had taken everything. The wreckage on the ski hill at Alpine Valley was eventually cleared away, the twisted metal hauled off, and the shattered earth left to heal under the falling snow. But the psychological wreckage left in the wake of the crash could not be so easily removed. For Tommy Shannon and Chris Layton, the world had fundamentally, irreversibly changed. The triumphant resurrection they had engineered just a year prior now felt like a cruel cosmic joke, a brief shining moment of hope allowed only so the final blow would hurt that much more. They were forced to attend the funerals, to stand under the blazing Texas sun and say goodbye to the man they had bled alongside. The industry executives stood in the back, wearing dark suits, already calculating the sales projections for the unreleased studio outtakes. The machine had consumed its greatest bluesmen, but the true tragedy belonged to the men left standing on the ground, the rhythm section forced to keep the beat in a world that had suddenly, violently lost its melody. The fight for survival had ended, but the agonizing struggle to find a reason to keep playing had just begun. The flight back to Austin, Texas was a journey through a vacuum. For Tommy Shannon and Chris Layton, the hours spent in the pressurized cabin of the aeroplane were devoid of sound, color, or meaning. Just 48 hours earlier, they had been standing on a stage in Wisconsin, the undisputed kings of a global blues revival, their instruments locked into a groove that felt invincible. Now they were traveling home to bury their frontman, their anchor, and their closest friend. The sheer, terrifying suddenness of the transition from absolute triumph to absolute devastation left them clinically in shock. When they touched down in the sweltering late August heat of Texas, they were not greeted by the usual chaotic swarm of roadies and tour managers handing out itineraries. They were greeted by the crushing, suffocating reality of planning a funeral. The touring machine had finally, definitively stopped. There were no more dates on the calendar. There was only the gaping, unfillable void left by the destruction of a Bell 206B helicopter. The funeral at Laurel Land Memorial Park in Dallas was a surreal, harrowing collision of private agony and public spectacle. Over 3,000 people descended upon the cemetery. There were fans who had driven hundreds of miles, weeping openly in the Texas sun. There were fellow musicians, including Stevie's brother Jimmy, Jackson Browne, Bonnie Raitt, and Stevie Wonder, their faces drawn tight with disbelief, and hovering at the edges of the crowd, dressed in sharp, dark suits, were the record executives. To Tommy and Chris, standing beside the casket of the man they had dragged back from the edge of a cocaine-induced death, the presence of the industry men was a bitter pill to swallow. These were the same men who had ignored Stevie's bleeding stomach ulcers in 1986, who had demanded the relentless touring schedule that broke his body, and who had ultimately chartered the flight into a fog-shrouded mountain to save a few hours of travel time. They were mourning the loss of a human being, yes, but they were also mourning the abrupt termination of a highly lucrative revenue stream. The sheer callous velocity with which the music industry pivots from logistics to posthumous marketing is a terrifying thing to witness. The wreckage on the Alpine Valley ski slope had barely been cleared before the boardrooms began calculating the commercial potential of Stevie's death. The narrative of the tragic fallen guitar hero is one of the most bankable tropes in rock and roll history. Epic Records wasted no time. Family Style, the collaborative album Stevie had just finished recording with his brother Jimmy, was released mere weeks after the crash. It sold millions of copies, fueled by the morbid fascination and genuine grief of the global public. A year later, the label released The Sky is Crying, a compilation of studio outtakes and unreleased tracks. It debuted in the top 10 and won a Grammy. The cash registers rang louder than ever. The machine did not stop. It simply changed its extraction method. It was no longer extracting sweat and blood from a living man on a stage. It was extracting profit from his ghost. Watching this corporate feeding frenzy from the sidelines plunged Tommy Shannon and Chris Layton into a profound psychological abyss. They had been stripped of their identity. They were Double Trouble, the greatest rhythm section in modern blues. But without the third point of their triangle, they were fundamentally unmoored. The trauma of the loss triggered a devastating relapse for Tommy Shannon. He had fought a desperate, bloody war to get clean alongside Stevie. They had gone to AA meetings together in the bowels of churches across the world, relying on each other to survive the temptations of the road. With his brother violently snatched away, the grief proved too heavy to carry sober. Tommy slipped back into severe depression and substance abuse, a tragic secondary casualty of the helicopter crash. Chris Layton, always the steady timekeeper, struggled to find a new rhythm in a life that had been entirely dictated by tour itineraries and studio sessions for over a decade. He watched his surviving brother falter, bearing the heavy, silent guilt of the survivor. It took years for the surviving members of Double Trouble to claw their way back from the darkness. They were forced to endure the grueling process of grief while constantly surrounded by the inescapable, commodified image of their dead friend. Stevie's face was on magazine covers, his music dominated the radio, and his legend grew to mythical proportions. But the legend often glossed over the brutal reality of what it took to produce that music. The media preferred to talk about his natural genius and his tragic fate, conveniently ignoring the systemic exploitation, the forced exhaustion, and the logistical arrogance that put him in the air on a night when he should have been safely on the ground. Eventually, the sheer, undeniable need to play music forced Tommy and Chris to pick up their instruments again. They formed the Archangels with Texas guitar prodigies Charlie Sexton and Doyle Bramhall II, a project that served as a necessary therapeutic bridge back to the world of the living. They later played with Kenny Wayne Shepherd and John Mayer, lending their legendary heavy Texas groove to a new generation of blues musicians. Tommy fought his way back to sobriety, a testament to his immense inner strength and the enduring lessons he had learned during his recovery with Stevie. But they never truly replaced what was lost. The space left by Stevie Ray Vaughan was too vast, too uniquely shaped by shared trauma and shared triumph, to ever be filled by another human being. When we look back at the legacy of Stevie Ray Vaughan in Double Trouble, we must look past the bronze statues and the platinum records. We must look at the human cost of the entertainment we consume. They were the men who saved the blues, injecting it with a lethal, necessary dose of adrenaline, just when the world was ready to leave it behind. But their story is also the ultimate harrowing cautionary tale of the 1980s music industry. It is a story that brutally exposes the invisible scaffolding of a business that views musicians not as artists, but as infinitely renewable resources, pack animals to be driven until they collapse. The tragedy of Double Trouble is that they actually beat the system. They survived the impossible pressure. They beat the chemical dependencies that were supposed to kill them, and they reclaimed their souls from the corporate machine. They recorded their masterpiece in step with clear minds and open hearts. They proved that you do not need to be a tortured, bleeding addict to create profound, world-changing art. And the industry's reward for this miraculous resurrection was to strap them right back into the same relentless, unforgiving schedule that had nearly destroyed them the first time. The helicopter crash became a tragic reminder of how demanding touring schedules can lead to dangerous decisions. The next time you listen to the ferocious, tearing opening riff of Scuttle Button or the deep weeping sorrow of Riviera Paradise, you are not just hearing a guitar player. You are hearing the sound of three men fighting a desperate war for their lives. You are hearing the blood on the fretboard, the exhaustion in the bones, and the desperate, clutching brotherhood that kept them alive in the darkest hotel rooms in the world. Their music is a document of survival, a brilliant, shining light forged in the crushing, suffocating darkness of corporate exploitation. The years on the road cost them their health, their peace of mind, and ultimately their frontman. The groove remains unbroken, a permanent, defiant testament to the human spirit that refused to be silenced, even when the world demanded everything they had left to give. In the quiet, dusty heat of Oak Cliff, Texas, where a young Stevie Ray Vaughan first picked up a plastic toy guitar, the silence is profound. The stadiums have emptied, the tour buses have rusted, and the executives who chartered the fatal flight have long since retired to comfortable estates. But the echo of the Stratocaster remains. It lives in the calloused fingers of teenagers playing in garages, and in the heavy, shuffling heartbeat of Tommy Shannon and Chris Layton, who carry the memory of their brother with every note they play. The machine won the physical battle on that foggy Wisconsin hillside, but it lost the war. The music escaped the wreckage. It rises above the spreadsheets, the tour itineraries, and the tragedy, forever reminding us that while the industry can buy a man's time and even dictate the manner of his death, it can never truly own his soul. The blues endures, played with the fierce, bloody conviction of those who survived the fire and those who burned within it.